Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Big Ideas Night, The Political Landscape, with Eddie S. Glaude Jr., Sarah Posner, John Dickerson, Gerald F. Seebe, moderated by Yamiche Alcindor. We are so excited for tonight's conversation on a topic that is so important right now, American politics. During this evening's event, we will be utilizing the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question, please feel free to ask it here, and Yamiche might just pull your question into the conversation. Please connect with other readers and guests using the chat function. We'd love to hear your thoughts, what you're reading, and how you're taking care of yourself during this difficult time. We just ask that everyone please stay respectful in the chat. Random House will also be providing the link to each of our panelists' books that are currently for sale in the chat. This event will be posted on YouTube, and we will send that link out to all guests in case you would like to rewatch or share with your friends and family. I am honored to introduce our moderator for this evening, Yamiche Alcindor. Yamiche is the White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour and a political contributor for NBC News and MSNBC. She often tells stories about the intersection of race and politics. At PBS, she has directly questioned President Trump a number of times and has traveled extensively to cover a range of issues, including the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus on Black people and communities of color, the protests following the death of George Floyd, and the consequences of President Trump's immigration policies. As a contributor for NBC News and MSNBC, she often appears on a number of shows, including Morning Joe, Andrea Mitchell Reports, and Meet the Press. She's currently working on her memoir titled Don't Forget, which will show how the precise path Alcindor took as the child of Haitian immigrants and as a journalism prodigy covering Black Lives Matter and civil rights abuses informs her point of view while reporting on one of the most chaotic administrations in our modern times. And now, may I present Yamiche Alcindor and Big Ideas Night, The Political Landscape.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited to be at this Random House event. I want to first introduce this amazing panel that we have tonight on what is really a big night in American politics, Joe Biden having just picked his vice presidential nominee. So I'm going to start off with Sarah Posner. She is a reporting fellow with Type Investigations. Her investigative reporting has appeared in Rolling Stone, Vice, The Nation, Mother Jones, The New Republic, Huffington Post, and Talking Points Memo. Her coverage and analysis of politics and religion has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, and many other outlets. She graduated from Wesleyan University and has a law degree from the University of Virginia. Her story, How Trump Took Hate Groups Mainstream, published before the 2016 election, and it won a Sidney Hillman Foundation Award. Thanks so much for being here, Sarah.
Thanks, Yamiche.
Eddie Glaude Jr., who I haven't seen since we were 10 seconds before, we were on MSNBC 10 seconds before Senator Harris was picked. Nice to see you again, Eddie. He is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. He is the former president of the American Academy of Religion, the largest professional organization of scholars of religion in the world. Glaude is the author of a number of books, including Begin Again and Democracy in Black. He hails from Moss Point, Mississippi, a small town on the Gulf Coast, and is a graduate of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Thanks so much for being here, Eddie. Gerald Seebe is the executive Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal, where he writes the weekly Capital Journal column. Previously, the Washington bureau chief of the Journal, he reported on the Middle East for the Journal in the early 1980s and covered the White House from 1987 through 1992. He has moderated 3 presidential debates and interviewed every president since Ronald Reagan. He won the Merriman Smith Award for coverage of the presidency, the Aldo Beckman Award for coverage of the White House, and the Gerald R. Ford Foundation Prize. He was part of a team of reporters who won the Pulitzer Prize in the breaking news category for their coverage of 9/11. In 2005, he won the William Allen White Foundation National Citation, and in 2009, the National Press Club's Award for Political Analysis. He appears as an analyst on CNBC, Fox News, PBS's Washington Week, CBS Face the Nation, and NBC's Meet the Press. With CNN's John Harwood, he wrote Pennsylvania Avenue, Profiles in Backroom Power. And last but not least is John Dickerson. He's a 60 Minutes correspondent. Prior to that, he was co-host of CBS This Morning, the anchor of Face the Nation, and CBS's chief Washington correspondent. John is also a contributing writer to The Atlantic, co-host of Slate's Politico Gabfest podcast, and host of the Whistle Stop podcast. Dickerson won the Ford Prize for distinguished reporting on the presidency and as Slate's chief political correspondent. Dickerson covered the White House for Time during his 12 years at the magazine. The 2020 presidential campaign will be the 7th that he has covered. That's a lot, John. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Yamiche.
So I'm going to start with the question that's on everyone's minds, which is, what do you make of Joe Biden picking Senator Kamala Harris as his vice presidential pick? What do you think it says about where this campaign is heading and about society and the moment that we're all living through? I'll start with you, Eddie.
Well, first of all, thank you, Yamiche, for all that you do and for taking the time out and moderating this panel. I want to thank Random House for providing us an occasion to dialogue in this moment. But, you know, it presents a stark choice to answer your question. We knew that November represented an important election for the future of the nation, because we know that our institutions are on shaky ground. We have lived for 3.5 years under a condition of uncertainty, under, that's a generous way of putting it, just under chaos. And so we knew that November was important. But now we have a stark choice between kind of two Americas, right? That the Biden ticket, Biden as old as he is, and Kamala Harris who she is, and Trump as old as he is, and Mike Pence is who he is, right? I mean, we couldn't have a starker choice between the two Americas. So I think so now I think it's been crystallized in the ticket. So that's the first thing. The historic fact of a woman of color, a Black woman as the VP nomination, we cannot run past. But I think it was a politically smart move on his part. A lot of the energy on the Democratic side was just simply to get Donald Trump out of office. Now there seems to be a different kind of excitement alongside that. And we have to kind of interrogate what that excitement will look like. And then the third point I would make is that given who Kamala Harris is, it almost in some ways holds off the description by the Trump campaign of the Biden campaign being completely overrun by the radical left, right? It would be very difficult to make that argument with Kamala on the ticket. But it also raises the question of how will the Biden campaign speak to the left wing of the Democratic Party? Those things are happening simultaneously. So I think it's just an exciting time for American politics, and we have a stark choice, clearly.
John, you've been covering presidential campaigns for a long time. What do you make of this? Where are we heading with this pick?
Well, I tend to see it first. Where we're heading is this is a historic moment. And as a political matter, Joe Biden has, first of all, he's gotten through the process. You know, people were tapping their watch or looking at their watch and tapping their toes saying he was taking too long, which is all sort of foolishness. We're a long way from when presidential nominees used to pick and announce their vice presidential choices at the convention, sometimes after just staying up late at night and figuring out who it would be. So he got through the process and made a bold choice, as Eddie was mentioning, from historic terms. But you also look at this as the first big decision that a candidate makes. People view them in this context as making a presidential level decision. And Biden has picked somebody who is cautious as a politician. That may have hurt her as a primary opponent, although arguably she made the riskiest move taking on Biden early in the primaries. But she's generally a cautious politician, which is just what you want when you're at the top of the ticket. But she's also very ambitious and has a whole string of clips of her in Senate hearings looking like somebody who is very much in command of what she's doing. And that matters because we're in this weird moment of everybody looking into screens like this all day long. There are no rallies. There are going to be a few key moments. One of them will be the debate in which Kamala Harris will be able to pull on that career history as a prosecutor, but also a lot of people are going to learn about her from watching those clips and having them recirculated on social media. And that will convey a sense of command, which is what people may want in a vice president. But in terms of being able to step into the job. But the last thing I'll say is this is always all about the president and what it shows about the president's decision-making abilities. And based on the reaction from the Democratic base and the reaction from the pundits, Biden has successfully pulled off his first big test as a candidate.
And Sarah, to you next. John's talking about the reactions. Eddie's talking about kind of whether or not the conservatives will be able to call Senator Harris the radical left. The president has already been out calling her nasty, calling her a radical lefty, saying that she wants to abolish the police. What do you make of what's been going on already? And what do you make of this pick?
Well, I think I agree with everybody else that it was a smart pick by Biden. And I think it's going to show whether there's a limit to Trump's ability to stoke his base with misogyny and racism, frankly. I mean, already out of the box, he was attacking her as a liar and calling her nasty. And they're again trying to play up this, the Democratic Party has been taken over by the radical left. And quite obviously, Kamala Harris is anything but the radical left, as is Joe Biden. But I think that this is the only play that the Trump campaign so far has shown us that they have against the Biden camp. Obviously, they're also going with the Ukraine corruption and so on with Biden, and they'll, in all likelihood, try to come up with something equally politically damaging to Harris. But I think that the question of, are voters really going to believe that the Biden-Harris ticket is some sort of radical leftist, un-American, anti-religion ticket when voters can see these two with their own eyes? And it's going to be, I think it's a big question about how much just playing to the base is going to work for him and how much this kind of thing is going to backfire for him, for Trump.
Jerry, jump in here. What do you make of all that we've been talking about?
Well, I think it's a fascinating pick because it's both safe and historic at the same time. And that's a very odd combination. But that's really what you have here. I mean, Kamala Harris was safe for Joe Biden in the sense that, he had already committed to picking a woman. There was enormous pressure on him to pick a woman of color. In that category, Kamala Harris is a woman of color who's already been playing in the major leagues. She's not a AA baseball player who's just been called up to the major leagues. She's been elected statewide twice in California, which would be the fourth largest economy in the world if it were standing alone as a country. She ran for president. She's been through the gauntlet, which, as all of us who've covered a campaign, I think John will agree with me on this, that if you've been through the gauntlet, you're a lot better at going through the gauntlet again. And she's done that, and that counts for a lot. She's been a prosecutor, and the rap on her in the Democratic primary was from the left because she was too tough a prosecutor. So she's going to be hard to pigeonhole as a radical left. So in all those ways, she was safe. Now, of course, she's also historic because first woman of color on a presidential ticket, a national ticket, that's a big deal. And so it's a fascinating combination of all those forces, which makes this a really powerful moment. Where we're going is perfectly clear. And I think Sarah and Eddie and John have all indicated this already. We are headed toward a campaign in which the Trump campaign is not going to run against Joe Biden. It's not even going to run against Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. It's going to run against the radical socialist extremists of the Democratic Party. And they're almost going to ignore Joe Biden in that context. And so there is a very important question here about whether Kamala Harris can be painted as part of that, the radical left wing of the Democratic Party. I saw President Trump at his briefing today say she was probably the most liberal senator in the Senate, and which is kind of laughable because what about Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren? What happened to them? But anyway, that's where we're headed, if that's your question, Yamiche.
I will now, I guess, in some ways, when you talk about this idea of her being painted as the most lefty senator, I was already seeing Black Lives Matter protesters who were saying they find the pick problematic. Now, they're, of course, just this one part of the Democratic base. But I want to ask a question about President Trump's approach to Black Lives Matter and the protests following George Floyd. The president has said that this is anarchist, that this is all about cities being overrun with domestic terrorists. Anyone can jump here, or I can also call your names. But what do you make of the way that the president has approached this moment that we're all living through?
Well, look, I'll just throw in a quick thought here, which is, look, there's some traction for him there's some traction to be gotten with that. I mean, there's a certain scariness about this moment, and part of it is scary in Middle America, and he's trying to turn it into a scary moment for suburban women in particular. I don't know if that's going to work. But there is and if you think back through history and you go back to 1968 and what happened to Hubert Humphrey, because he got basically lumped up with people who were in the streets of Chicago during the convention, that's not a good look for a candidate of either party. So, you know, there's some traction there for President Trump. I think, as his wont, he'll overplay that. But he doesn't have a lot of great cards to play here right now, because it's a great distraction from the coronavirus, which is still, at the end of the day, the #1 issue on most people's minds.
Eddie, I'll come to you, because I think we've had conversations about where President Trump stands when you look at the history of the Republican Party or the history of politics in this country. What do you make of his approach to Black Lives Matter, especially when you think about the fact that he's using, in some ways, the Department of Justice to go into cities now ahead of the 2020 election?
Well, I mean, look, I think it's important for us to realize that Donald Trump is a caricature of what has been standard features of Republican politics, at least over my lifetime. So the idea that he's going to invoke law and order in response to protest makes sense to me, right? I mean, we can trace it not only, you know, through Reagan, but all the way to Richard Nixon and even before. So the idea of Donald Trump invoking law and order as a response to protests around the public murder of George Floyd is pretty consistent with a political playbook that many of us have seen over the course of our lifetime. It's how he plays it. He's a caricature of it, because he doesn't play it in any subtle way. He plays it without dog whistles, but with foghorns, right? He just says the silent part out loud. They're going to come and they're going to destroy your communities. They're going to, their aim is to undermine the pillars of Western civilization, is the implication here. So I think it's important, though, that we understand that Black Lives Matter. When we look at the polling data, it seems to have shifted in public opinion as almost the same way, you know, same-sex marriage did. It almost happened suddenly. So when we look at the polling data around who supports Black Lives Matter, we see a broad swath of American society actually saying that they support this particular movement. What that means in its details, we would have to drill down. But the point is that there is a shift. And I think that shift reflects a broad, I wouldn't say consensus, but a broad judgment across an interesting cross-section of Americans that the country is broken. And we see that cross-section in Minneapolis, we see it in Portland, we see it in Seattle. And so it's going to be very difficult to try to pigeonhole it in the old kind of, how can I put this, politics of exploiting white fear, white grievance, and white resentment. It still can happen, because those racial divides are real. It's not like Donald Trump's election just wiped them out, right? But I think it's important for us to understand that a certain way in which he's hailing white suburban women, the certain way in which he's kind of trying to stoke white grievance might not work, because it's happening against the backdrop of a general kind of judgment that the country is broken, and of course against the backdrop of the devastation of COVID-19.
That what you're talking about in kind of the history of that brings me to Sarah and Unholy. I had a list of questions to ask you about essentially the same question, which is that white evangelicals and the alt-right most think have kind of formed this bond with President Trump, so that when some see him as stoking racial divisions, he has an audience that's clapping for him that maybe is a little invisible, but that is certainly there. Talk a little bit about that and why that is.
Right. I think it's invisible to a lot of other people. It's very visible to Trump himself. And I think that explains a lot about why he's playing directly to this audience. So Trump energized, and during his first presidential campaign, he energized the alt-right and the Christian right at the same time. And it was the same the same rhetoric and policy proposals that appealed to the alt-right, that was appealing to white evangelicals who were going to his rallies and listening to his anti-immigrant rhetoric and listening to his anti-immigrant policy proposals and his attacks on his verbal attacks on Black Lives Matter protesters at his rallies. These were things that were happening in 2015, 2016 when he was running in the primary. And so Trump is going back to that well, right? To the well of his voters who have supported him and cheered him on throughout his campaign and presidency, when he invokes these racist stereotypes, or when he plays on white grievances about civil rights advances or about immigration. And so I think that in this moment of Black Lives Matter, he sees it as pivotal that he keeps this base in his camp. And he doesn't really see outside of that. And they're being very supportive of him. And I think that in the white evangelical world right now, you'll hear a lot of talk like, yes, we hear what Black Lives Matter are saying, and we think that the murder of George Floyd was a tragedy, but, and there's always a but, but our streets have been taken over by anarchists and Antifa and these anti-Christian protesters who are burning Bibles. And we come to find out today in the New York Times that the Bible burning in Portland was something that was blown up by Russian intelligence. So he's just going to keep dipping into that well. I think he doesn't have another play, and this is where he's going. And I think that his attacks on Biden's religion that were coming late last week and early this week, that he's anti-religion, he's anti-God, he's going to hurt God. That's all part of this package.
And so you're talking about President Trump dipping into a well. Jerry, can you talk a little bit about whether or not you think President Trump has changed the Republican Party? Did he just take advantage of what was already there?
Look, I think, and this is the theme of my book, which is captured in the title, which is "We Should Have Seen It Coming," is sort of answers your question, which is we should have seen it coming. There was kind of an open door that Donald Trump walked through, and you could see this path to that door kind of being paved over the last 2 to 3 decades. Really, it was a long time coming. The party changed. The party, and Donald Trump understood, and I would say today understands this better than most of the other people in his party. There were a lot of people who moved over the last 2 decades from either the Democratic Party or the middle and nowhere into the Republican Party for cultural reasons. They didn't like prayer. They didn't like abortion. They wanted prayer in schools. They hated gay marriage. They didn't like immigration. Changed the culture and the face of the country in their view. They were moving into the Republican Party for cultural reasons. The party changed. It went from sort of the country club to the Sam's Club, as Tim Pawlenty, the former governor of Minnesota, put it a decade ago. That's the change that occurred. And that change made the party more populist, and it made the idea of Donald Trump much more palpable to primary voters because they were different. You know, Roy Blunt, who's a senator from Missouri, told me a year or 2 years ago that in his state, and this has nothing to do with Donald Trump, this is a kind of a standard conservative Republican senator from Missouri. He said the way I got elected changed over the last 20 years. I used to get elected, like all Republicans, by winning big in the suburbs of Kansas City and St. Louis, while the Democrats won South and Southeast Missouri, which is kind of the Ozarks part of Missouri. That was the Democratic part of the state. Well, that's completely turned around in the last 20 years, he was telling me. And the people who show up at my rallies are different. They're not wearing sport coats and blazers. They're wearing baseball hats and jeans. That's the change of the party. And it was ready for Donald Trump. And I would argue that's not going to go away whether Trump wins or loses in November. That's going to be the Republican Party to some extent for a while now.
Jen, I want to come to you because I've never heard that the way that Jerry put it, being that it's country club to Costco club, essentially saying that there was a shift in this party. Did you see that shift when you were reporting? Did it happen? And what, maybe, were there any times that you thought this party is completely changing?
Well, it's funny that the shift of country club to Sam's Club was an attempt by Tim Pawlenty, the governor of Minnesota, to try to create an argument for himself as a candidate. It didn't work at all. because he was he may have shopped at the Sam's Club, but he sort of followed the rules, and he waited in line to check out, and then he went to his car and roughly behaved himself. Donald Trump behaviorally tapped into a deeper and more rooted sense of identity that Jerry's talking about. You had always seen it. I mean, my first campaign in 1992 covering Buchanan voters, you see some of the beginnings of what you would recognize as the Trump voter, and then basically covering Republican politics all the way through. It's just that they never had a champion like Donald Trump, and they never held total sway in the party. There still were those other legs of the Republican stool, as the cliche goes. And what ended up happening, those other legs of the stool have kind of gone away. There were the fiscal conservatives. They're mostly gone now. I mean, they talk about fiscal conservatism in this battle, most recently over the extension of unemployment benefits. But for 3 years, there's been not much discussion on the fiscal conservatism front, while Donald Trump has contributed mightily to the size of the debt and deficit. And the national security part of the Republican stool, other than Trump's support for more defense spending, has lost a lot of their belief in spreading democracy and freedom throughout the world through the use of American power. But back to your question, did I see it coming? Again, I'd seen parts of it. What was, and Sarah will be able to speak to this, what I mistook and misunderstood is, after spending a whole career talking to voters and covering Republican politics and spending a lot of time with evangelicals and hearing again and again the story about how Ronald Reagan never took off his jacket in the Oval Office because he had such respect for the job. He did, in fact, take his jacket off, but nevertheless, that story was told over and over again about the character and personal integrity of the candidates that were running for office, and how Bill Clinton had bruised America by his personal behavior and having that office. I was not expecting so many evangelicals. During the primary in South Carolina, Donald Trump said George Bush should be impeached for starting the Iraq War. Bush was a favorite son in South Carolina, and 70% of evangelicals in the primary voted for Trump. I did not expect them to lock in so tightly to Donald Trump, given everything my reporting career had told me about the primacy of personal moral code that they had talked about over the years.
Talking about a moral code, talking about kind of the times that we're living in. Eddie, I want to come to you because the thing that I've been thinking about, it's what would James Baldwin say about the moment that we're living in? You wrote about it. You're a scholar of James Baldwin. Tell us a little bit about what you think he would say and what he did say about these times.
Well, I think, the way I don't want to try to put words in Jimmy's mouth. There's over 7,000 pages of his words, so we'll just let him speak for himself in some ways. But I think, Donald Trump is a reflection of who we are. He's not an exception, right? And so, it's one way to, John traces him through the Buchanan voter, but there's a way in which you can see Ronald Reagan appealing to the George Wallace voter. The way in which the Republican Party has always danced with and been in bed with this particular element of the country in some ways, right? The way in which we misdescribed the Tea Party and what was driving the Tea Party. We thought it was just simply economic dislocation and anxiety, when we realized, at least the social science data is showing us, that racial anxiety was driving the economic anxiety, right? That there is a sense in which, for Black people, for example, for many Black activists, Ronald Reagan was as notorious as George Wallace. He was the governor of California in the context of the repression of the Black Panther Party. He was the governor of California in the context of Angela Davis being put on the FBI most wanted list, right? So there's a sense in which 1980 represented the kind of closing of the door of the nation really thinking that it could imagine itself as a genuinely multiracial democracy, because Ronald Reagan's election was principally to dismantle everything the 1960s represented, right? To dismantle it all. And so just as America reached for a Hollywood B-list actor, a kind of fantasy around a certain conception of the country as inherently white, here we are in this moment with demographic shifts generating all of this anxiety. right? These racially ambiguous children on Cheerios commercials, right? And what do we do post 2008 and 2012 when those demographic shifts bubble up and produce the first Black president? We reach for not only the vitriol of the Tea Party, but we see voter ID laws and voter suppression, right? And the Electoral College, Donald Trump wins. And so Baldwin wrote in a moment of the what I describe in the book as the country's betrayal, as the moment in which the country had a chance to imagine itself otherwise, but then double down on its fears, double down on its belief that this was a white nation in the vein of old Europe. And so in the face of the efforts of the mid-20th century, we got the call for law and order. So we put in place the building blocks of the carceral state. We got the tax revolt in California, which shredded the social safety net. We got the hard hat rebellions. We got the violence around busing. We got the forgotten American, the silent majority. We're hearing all of this again because we're at a moment in which the country is really grappling with who do we take ourselves to be? And Baldwin insisted that in these moments, we always double down on the lie. We double down on this belief that we are this shining city on the hill, and that shining city on the hill it gleams a brilliant white, right? And so here we are in this moment facing a kind of choice, a moral reckoning. And Jerry mentioned earlier that the images of Seattle and Portland might play in the suburbs, right? Well, what will that do? It will give people an excuse to double down on the ugliness in interesting sorts of ways, as opposed to confronting the deep contradictions that define our current way of living. So the short answer, Yamiche, Baldwin would say, we need to tell ourselves the truth and stop lying and open the door for us to be otherwise.
Does anyone want to jump in just before I go to the next question? Because
I know
make
Sarah
sure you guys
has
have
a whole bunch of this.
I want to pick up on something Eddie said earlier. I think that his assessment of the national reaction to the protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder is exactly as he described it, which is both the reaction. What has struck me about the polling with respect to the president is that the people have made a judgment about his fitness for office. And so when he runs the Nixon playbook or the Wallace playbook and talks about law and order, there's a judgment people are making about his lack of success in it, even hearing the voices of the protesters. And he has not only shown no particular interest in hearing the voices, when he had his moment to spend the presidential capital, to use the full pageantry of the office and the levers of the office, he literally pushed the protesters aside who were peacefully protesting and held a law and order moment from which the military later shrunk because of their role in it. So he didn't just not hear what the protesters were saying, he actively heard something else. And the people seem to be making a judgment, as far as the polling is concerned, that that's inconsistent with the job that he holds. And so if that continues to be the case, then the more he plays this electoral card, the more they will have that judgment. They're also making a similar judgment on his lack of success with COVID-19. The ultimate question, though, is whether the people who answer the polls reflect the people who are going to vote in the 4 or 5 or 6 key battleground states. And you would have a situation, if there's a disconnect between those two, the country vastly feeling one way, but the electorate in key battleground states feeling another, you're going to see an even bigger tear in the fabric of America after the election.
Let me jump in. I don't want to stop Sarah, but let me just jump in with one thought based on something John just said, which is, I think, an interesting point that shouldn't be forgotten here. Part of the Trump campaign calculation is that there's still a hidden Trump vote out there. There certainly was in 2016. If you think about it, even in a fairly high turnout race like 2016, 39% of the country's eligible voters didn't show up. Who were those people? Well, if you go back and look through the states that Trump won, there were a lot of Trump voters who showed up who came out of the woodwork, but there are a lot of them who didn't show up, who are still in the woodwork. And part of the Trump campaign's calculation is that you can turn on a whole bunch of those people in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And the data, David Wasserman from the Cook Political Report did an interesting look at who didn't vote in 2016. And in those states, a lot of the people who didn't vote were working class white males, and that's obviously the prototypical Trump voter. So part of the calculation here isn't just to keep the base, as Sarah was suggesting. It's actually to grow the base in ways we miss sometimes. That's one point. I just want to make one response to something Eddie said. I don't think, Eddie, that, and I spent a lot of time going back through this, that the Tea Party its origins were really based in race. It was based in anger, and it was based initially at anger at white bankers in New York and on Wall Street. Now, I think racist elements latched onto that over time and fairly quickly, frankly. But in its roots, it was really white populist anger directed at as much as white elitists as anything else, and then it morphed into something different over time. But I just that's what I concluded, having gone back and replowed all that ground for the book.
And Sarah, oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I wanted to add something onto what Eddie was saying about the Ronald Reagan moment. Ronald Reagan's election was the first election in which the religious right attached itself to the Republican Party and made it its goal to get the Republican candidate elected. And at that time, the religious right had organized around not abortion. This is something that I talk a lot about in Unholy. It was not about abortion, but it was a backlash against school desegregation that manifested itself in a number of different ways. But so if you want to think about the origin of the religious right and this moment that Eddie is talking about with James Baldwin and Reagan, this is the moment when the religious right first got involved in Republican politics and has been using a lot of the same playbook, the idea that America is a Christian nation, that a lot of these social changes and legal changes and political changes that were happening in the second half of the 20th century were anti-American, anti-Christian, damaging the Christian nation. And this is kind of the through line that you see to Trump.
And I want to then move to Jerry, because I think as we've been talking about President Trump and kind of the shifting ways that he's been able to kind of have power and have support, I want to ask you about Joe Biden. This is a double question, Jerry. One is, how does Joe Biden deal with a political candidate? Because this is the thing that really interests me the most about this election. How does he deal with an opponent who kind of has lowered the standards for himself so much that there are times where expectations of President Trump are he's read a great speech, as a result he's acting presidential, when you have Joe Biden, who is now having to prove himself and try to combat the fact that he has to be held maybe to a higher standard, even by his own Democratic Party. And how does he walk the line of the progressive left? Obviously, he picked Senator Harris today, but how does he hold on to power while trying to balance all of those things?
Well, look, I think it's going to be hard. It was always going to be hard to keep a foot in the center and to still please the people on the left. But that's kind of what you're supposed to do as a national candidate. I think Biden's got two big things going for him. One is he's not going to be easy for Trump or the Trump campaign or the Republican Party to kind of reintroduce to America in a different way. People know Joe Biden pretty well. He's not a blank slate. They're not going to be able to turn him into something that he's not, I think, the way some other, pick your alternative Democrats, somebody who could have been portrayed in a certain way, who could be defined by the Republican Party and the Trump campaign. You can't redefine Joe Biden that easily. Secondly, in some ways, all Joe Biden has to do is be himself, because whatever you think of Joe Biden, and he's, maybe he stumbles around and he talks too much and he doesn't get to the point and all, but nobody thinks he's not a genuine person, and all he really and by the way, he is a religious person. Anybody who's known him knows that. So all he kind of has to do is be himself, because he is kind of the anti-Trump in that sense. So is it hard? Yeah. But on the other hand, it's kind of easy for somebody like Joe Biden, because there's a certain element of just being yourself makes the point in 2020.
John, I want to ask you about your book. You titled it "The Hardest Job in the World." talk to me a little bit about that concept in the presidency and how you understand the idea of the buck stops at the White House in these times where the president said recently, would say in the last few months, that even the coronavirus, he doesn't have any responsibility for how this response has been at times, frankly, bungled.
Was that in a response to a question you asked?
Possibly.
Yeah. I just want to make sure I give you credit. I didn't want to not give you credit.
Kristen and Welker from NBC and I double teamed the president and was asking about responsibility that day.
Well, so the idea of the hardest job is basically that that there have been so many things that have been lumped on the president's plate, and the presidents have grabbed over time. That there is just the to-do list is too long, and that governing, because of partisanship and the weakness of Congress, we turn to the president when we shouldn't. We should turn to Congress instead. But because Congress is locked up for a variety of reasons, Congress is no longer able to handle its tasks, and the president no longer has a willing partner. And I spend a fair amount of time going back and looking at the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, which Jerry has probably heard 87,000 times, where people say, if they could only do what Reagan and O'Neill did. But Reagan and O'Neill operated in a far different political atmosphere, where Ronald Reagan could be elected, and in 114 congressional districts, there were Democrats who were going to the House of Representatives whose voters had also voted for Ronald Reagan. So there was all of this split ticket voting that created political pressures that set the conditions for bipartisanship in a way that we don't have today. On the question of buck stops here, I went back and looked at the BP oil spill, because it seemed to me that we had gotten to the part with the presidency, and I was trying to sketch out why the job is so difficult. And as LBJ said about the presidency, sometimes it's like being a jackass in a hailstorm. You just have to sit there and take it. And I thought, well, that doesn't seem like a very reasonable way to run the top position in the leader of the free world. So I looked back at the BP oil spill, which was a situation in which President Obama he didn't initiate this problem. The federal government is not particularly skilled at all in capping oil wells. And yet day after day, he was on the hook for finding a solution to the belching oil that was going into the Gulf. And that was a standard that when you talk to the Obama people, I was expecting them to say, well, yeah, what are we going to do? We're not experts at this. BP wasn't being straight with us. And yet we were going down in the numbers. Our approval rating was going down because everybody expected the president to solve this. But ultimately, Dennis McDonough and others in the Obama administration said, and that's the way it has to work, because there's only one complaint window for people to go to, and that's the presidency. And so it is unfair. But the expectation is that the president is responsible, and the president should do as much as possible to prepare for these kinds of events, which is why George Bush in 2005 turned to Fran Townsend, his top terrorism person, and said, we need a plan to fight a pandemic, because he knew it might hit, and why Obama also had a plan. But we must hold presidents accountable, and the buck must stop there, because there's no other way to force a president to act, and also to hold him to get the bureaucracy to move. If they know the president's on the hook for it, people will snap into action as best as they can. But the funny thing is that expression, which has come to mean the president's responsible for everything that happens on his watch, actually wasn't what Truman meant. What Truman meant is there are some decisions only a president can make. It's only the commander-in-chief's job to decide whether to use atom bombs. And so people shouldn't second guess when there's a decision that has to be made and you don't know the calculations that go into it. So it's slightly changed over time to mean basically taking responsibility for anything that happens under your presidency, but there's a very useful accountability function to that phrase.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've gotten a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to jump into the questions. The first one I have is, what is happening in Chicago, Seattle, or Portland help or hurt the Biden-Harris ticket? Anyone can jump in, but I can also start calling names if I need to.
Go, Sarah.
So does the question mean what is happening on the ground, or what is happening with regard to the Trump administration's response, right? So I feel like what is happening on the ground, and I think maybe Chicago Chicago is different from Portland, but broadly speaking, what's happening on the ground, I think, is not really. I think that the Trump campaign is trying to portray these things as really scary. Our urban cities are being taken over by radical leftists, and this is what all of America is going to be like if you elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And so they're trying to scaremonger over it. And then on the Democratic side, or on the left-hand side, you have people genuinely concerned and terrified, actually, of the federal government sending in troops to, in the case of Portland, kidnap people off the street and and detain them without telling them why they were being taken in. And just the prospect of a summer with protesters standing off with federal troops seems pretty scary. And on the surface, it seems like that would help Trump, because the chaos is kind of the point for him. And so therefore, he could point to that and say, see, like this is the chaos that the leftists bring us. But on the other side of it, I think Biden and Harris could say, look, this is the chaos that Donald Trump has brought us. Here are protesters against racial injustice, and their response is to crack down on them. Is that the America you want? Or do you want an America where the president and the vice president try to address these issues with policy, or with meeting with people and hearing their concerns and their complaints and trying to enact policy around that? So I think that Trump is banking on the chaos frightening people, but he's the creator of the chaos in a lot of instances.
So
I'll
give you an interesting poll number. So 2 months ago, right when the George Floyd ferment was really getting rolling, but before Seattle and or rather Portland and Chicago really came into being, we asked the poll question. We said, is the country pretty much under control, or is it pretty much out of control? 80% of the people we polled, and this was April, I think, or May, said the country was out of control, which is a really frightening number. Now, is that a number that says basically 80% of the people, that's a bad look for an incumbent because you're in charge and the country is out of control on your watch? That hurts Donald Trump. On the other hand, does that 80% number set the stage for a law and order campaign? It could go either way. I think if it looks as if it's increasingly out of control, I think the law and order message could have much more resonance. So I think it has the potential to help the Trump campaign if it appears it's continuingly out of control. But, I cited 1968, and 1968 hurt Trump from the Democrats because Democrats were in the White House and they were supposed to stop this and they weren't. So as John said, if you're in the White House, you're supposed to take care of these things.
One quick question, Jerry, was there any distinction on the out of control? Because you hear a lot of Democrats feeling like things are out of control because no matter what the president says, he never gets sanctioned, they believe. And so they feel that it's out of control for that reason. It was
surprisingly bipartisan, actually. I was surprised. I don't remember the exact breakdown, but it was like something like 50 to 60% of Republicans thought things were out of control as well.
And one would be really hard pressed to see who's centered in that poll. So who's thinking it's out of control, and for what does it mean to begin to think about? So let me ask it in a different way. Say it in a different way, Jerry. What happens when we change who is the center of our political imagination in the country?
Yeah.
Who are we thinking about, right? So what does it mean to think that for white suburbia, the country looks out of control because the city of Seattle or Portland seems aflame, or Minneapolis is on fire, and then the Democratic Party or whomever, the Biden ticket, right, adjusts its political platform in order to speak to their desire, their fears, their grievances, and the like. But what if it's the case that if you center a different political subject, right, then what looks out of control, right, is exactly what Sarah just laid out, right? A country that allows a certain form of policing to terrorize communities that goes unchecked and the like. So part of what I think we're experiencing in this moment is a decentering of the assumptions that drive the body politic. And we don't quite know how to describe what's happening on the ground. But if we center a certain political subject, then we're going to draw these sorts of conclusions about the effect of the judgment that we're out of control. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Or am
Yeah, it does. I agree. No, I agree with that. I agree with that. And by the way, it's hard to know what people thought was out of control, because you also have not just George Floyd, you also had the coronavirus and an economic collapse.
Exactly.
But I think about 1979, which is kind of where my book starts, a year when I think Americans decided the wheels had fallen off the cart. You know, you had stagflation, you had a terrible economy, you had an energy crisis, you had gas lines, and then you had Iranian students seizing the embassy in Tehran. And I think people decided we have just lost control here, to go back to this phrase. And Jimmy Carter was president, and he was supposed to find some way to bring this stuff under control, and he failed. And that opened the door for Ronald Reagan. So that may be the political effect of a feeling that, for whatever reason, things just aren't under control the way I would like them to be.
Mm-hmm. The next question is, Senator Harris is a Black Baptist from a Christian and Hindu family who is married to a Jewish man. She is running with Biden, who would be the first Catholic president since JFK. Does all that help blunt anti-religion smears from Trump and his religious right allies? Anyone can take that. I was eyeing Sarah, but go ahead. I think I heard someone else laughing, so go ahead.
I think there was Eddie that was laughing. It won't blunt them from the standpoint that Trump's religious right base doesn't think that Joe Biden, who's a pro-choice Catholic, is a real Catholic or a real Christian, right? So this is about ideology more than it is about religion. So to them, and then Trump is echoing this, and his allies are echoing this. You know, Pence is echoing it when he speaks on the campaign trail, when he speaks to, I heard him on a podcast today talking about this. Bill Barr is essentially saying this when he's talking about, you know, the leftists have a, you know, that's their secular religion. So he's basically erasing liberal Catholics or liberals of other religions, right? By saying, if you're on the left, you know, you have this secular militant religion. And so they're not going to stop using that playbook. But I think I certainly there are some voters who would look at that and say, you know, Joe Biden's clearly a practicing Catholic. And, you know, so I think that you're going to see more of this from Trump and the religious right. Whether it works or not remains to be seen. They don't have the same material that they did with Obama, but they may come up with the 2020 version of that, you know, implying that he's a Muslim or not a real Christian.
And Eddie, I want to go to this. I think that's a critical part of this, which is how will voter suppression, specifically with regards to mail-in voting, play into this election? Is the common perception that voter suppression favors Republicans really supported by data? And I would add to that, of course, is this misinformation campaign that's going and playing into the idea of mail-in voting. The president, of course, has decided that Florida and Arizona are okay to mail-in vote.
I think Getty might have had a technical glitch.
Oh, well, John, you're up.
I was just looking at, there's a new Marquette School poll that came out, and it says in Wisconsin, among those who say they will vote by mail, 81% support Biden, 14% Trump. Among those who will vote on Election Day, 67% support Trump, 26% support Biden. Those numbers have probably gotten a little wonky because questions about mail-in ballots are now a sorting technique for underlying partisanship. So if you're pro-Trump, you're going to say you don't like mail-in ballots, regardless of your personal behavior. But it does give you some indication, and the president said it gives indication that the Democrats are more likely to be in favor of and benefit from mail-in ballots. Because to the extent that more Democrats can vote, that's better for the Democratic Party. And there's some data that suggests, and I think this is still the case, that Democratic voters are just harder to reach and harder to get to the polls on Election Day than Republican voters, although that may have changed in the canvassing techniques that are being used now, and it's a state by state issue. But it's clearly it's clearly going to be one of the interesting things to watch for me is that there is also a political science study that says that when people feel like their vote is being taken away from them or being minimized that they are even more anxious to vote, that essentially it becomes a turnout mechanism that backfires on the person who's launching it. And so if this gets framed in that way, then it could very well backfire.
I would just add that this idea that by definition mail-in voting helps Democrats is just nonsense. It's like, go to Utah, ask people in Utah, which is a very red state, and it's very heavily mail-in. It's Republicans are organized. They're supposed to be organized, right? So go out, organize your people, and get them to mail in the ballots. It's that part of it, I think, is just a canard. It's just not by definition true that it helps Democrats. It helps Democrats if Democrats do a better job of organizing their people, but that's all.
What about voter suppression, Jerry? Sticking with you, the question also is, does voter suppression favor Republicans, as maybe common knowledge thinks and some people think? Is that actually true?
Well, I think that part is true. I mean, I think voter suppression is about trying to keep certain people away from the polling place. And, we know who those people are. They're people of color, and they're people in inner cities. And there are a lot of ways to do that, right? But that's different from saying that mail-in ballot is a fraud machine for Democrats. That's what is just not true. Voter suppression is a different thing. I suppose they're related. Voter suppression has very specific goals in mind. It always has. And that's at work as well at the same time.
Eddie, you're back with us. I want to go off of the idea we're having this conversation about voter suppression. How concerned are you about the November election and potential constitutional crises that might arise given the challenges with voting and persistent attempts to suppress the vote?
Oh, I'm horrified actually by it all, and I think this is for the first time in my lifetime. I'm worried about the peaceful transition of power. I'm worried about what happens if he wins or if he loses, right? That the legitimacy of the the electoral process has already been called into question, and that there will be ongoing efforts to delegitimize the voting process across states, and it will be driven in a number of different ways. We already have historic lows in terms of the American trust in the body politic, in government more generally or more specifically. And so it seems to me that we're going into an election cycle, right, or an election in November, where there is deep suspicion that this is not going to go well. And then you combine that with actors who have already let us know that they're not going to behave, right, consistent with democratic norms, that we need to be concerned. Right. And then you combine that with this fact, and Democrats need to really pay attention to this, that many schools are going to be online. So what does that mean for what's going to happen in Wisconsin now that most of those students aren't going to be at Madison? What does it mean in Pennsylvania? What does it mean in Michigan? Right. When many of those students will be home in their states, right, in their home states, how is that going to impact the way in which we read these battleground states, right? So I'm deeply concerned, right? And then the questions around voter IDs. We saw, let's put it this way, what happened in Georgia, right, was a kind of canary in the coal mine to let us know what possibly can happen, right, or what will happen in November. So I think we need to buckle up because we're on our way to a moment that's going to test the very, very foundation of the country, it seems to me. And I'm not being hyperbolic. I think that's true.
Sarah, are you buckling up, especially as someone who is very familiar with, even though Eddie said both sides in terms of the worry that's there with Democrats or Republicans, but how concerned are you given your expertise and what we've been talking about the religious right and the alt-right?
Well, I think that what worries me is that we're not going to know the outcome. The whole election worries me. There's going to be a lot of disinformation and deep fakes and Russian interference and all of that. We're already seeing it. But I think layered on top of that is that on election night, we're not going to know the result. And so Trump is going to have this extra time to raise questions and doubts in people's mind, raise questions and doubts in the minds of his followers, who'll then amplify that on their social media and so forth, that he'll pick away at whatever state where the results aren't in, or the state that he thinks he's going to lose where the results aren't completely in. And that's the kind of thing that worries me, because then everyone is going to start to wonder about, are the votes being counted properly? Are we ever really going to know the results? And it's very concerning.
So, yeah, and can I add one other thing, Amish, that, we have in the last 2 decades had 2 presidents who were elected with while losing the popular vote. They're both Democrats. If that happens again, and that's a real possibility, there will be 3 times in the last 20 years in which a Democratic candidate won the popular vote and didn't win the presidency. I don't think that's a good situation for the country to be in. I don't want to think about what the aftermath of that looks like. And that's a very real possibility, regardless of what President Trump does to accept or not to accept the results of the election. Even if it's clear and that's the outcome. And I asked our pollsters a couple of weeks ago, what's the maximum by which Donald Trump could lose the popular vote and still win in the Electoral College? And they said maybe 5%. Well, if he loses the popular vote by 5% and wins in the Electoral College, there are going to be a lot of people whose heads explode. And I just don't think that's good for the country. That's all.
Especially, just to add on to that, if he's won the Electoral College using the techniques that we've seen so far, which will inflame people already. So the losers in the popular vote they won't just have lost an election, they will have lost a searing election that touches them at some of the most sensitive parts of their public identities.
Can I just add this really quickly? Now, if he, and this is the thing, if he loses, not just simply if he wins, but if he loses, I'm still worried about the hardcore Trump voters and whether or not they will accept the legitimacy of his defeat. So what we're talking about is that if Biden wins and the like, at least in my mind, right, what we're talking about is that. But I'm really concerned that if Donald Trump loses, will the 30%, 38%, 40% concede? And what are they willing to do if they don't concede? And I think I know people are gaming this out across the country, but I think we need to be thinking about this more deliberately in the public domain. But.
And one last question. I thought of you, John, when I read this. It seems President Trump gets all the credit / blame for everything. Would it be useful to talk about the people behind the scenes who are really driving the decisions and policies, thinking about Stephen Miller and anti-immigration, or Pence's scare tactics, this person says, when it comes to the war and freedom of religion? How much is that playing into this? And what do you make of that, John?
Well, I think that most people who've studied and been in White Houses would like it if there were more of a team aspect to the Trump presidency. It's basically a presidency. It's an Oval Office presidency. They talk about there's a whole theory about trying to spread a presidency out through the cabinets and have a cabinet government, which was a bit of a failure under Jimmy Carter. This has brought not only decision making into the White House, but brought it into the Oval Office. So I think that anybody else who is carrying out things is doing so. The Stephen Miller and Mike Pence are doing it either with the president's full approval or before or after they do it. So I think it all emanates from the same place, which is from the president. And while I think in elections it's crucial that we pay attention to who a president surrounds himself with, because lots of decisions are made by people other than the president. And the decisions that are placed before the president in an incredibly busy day are framed by people who have certain points of view. And so a president gets option A or option B and may never be introduced to options C, D, and E, which might be closer to what the country really wants to do. A lot of the decisions are framed and shaped by these people. That's less the case with this non-traditional White House, because the president will do as he pleases, regardless of how the decisions are framed for him. But I do think in general terms, paying attention to the team the president surrounds him or herself with is vitally important, and understanding whether the president has a theory for how that team should work. If you look in the business world, they're obsessed with the idea of building teams and managing teams and how you do that well and effectively. We never talk about that in presidential campaigns. And we should think about it a lot more.
Mm. I always joke at times, we call him President Trump, but we could also call him Chief of Staff Trump, Vice President Trump, Communications Director Trump, because he does so many of those jobs in one White House.
Yeah, there aren't a lot of people who think that's a good way to run a railroad.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for offering your thoughts, for talking about your books, for really putting this moment into context. I think this was a great night to have this discussion, given all the big political news that happened today. Thanks so much, John, Jerry, Sarah, and Eddie.
Thank you,
Thank you, Yamiche.
Thank you,
Appreciate it very
Yamiche.
much.
Appreciate it.
Good to see everybody.
Yeah.
Stay safe, everybody.